When I was 64 years old, my son cleared out my RRSP account, signed over my Georgian Bay property using a power of attorney I did not knowingly grant him, and drove his family west to Calgary in a rented moving truck. They left me $150 in a white envelope on the kitchen table, tucked beneath my late wife's ceramic sugar bowl. The note inside, written in my daughter-in-law's careful, slanted handwriting, said only 2 words: "You'll manage." 14 years later, my grandson was sitting in a structural engineering lecture at the University of Toronto when his professor put a photograph on the projector screen. The image showed the Pinecrest Senior Housing Complex in Sudbury, a project I had designed and fully funded through my foundation. The professor told the class it had been built by one of the most quietly influential engineers in Northern Ontario. My grandson recognized the last name on the screen. He slipped out of the lecture hall and called me from the corridor outside, barely able to speak. Within 9 hours, I had 178 missed calls from the son who had left me with nothing. Before I tell you what happened next, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you've ever been underestimated by the very people who were supposed to have your back. My phone was sitting on the edge of my desk when it lit up. The screen glowed in the dark of my study, that relentless vibration I had been watching pile up since early afternoon. 178 missed calls. Every single one was from a Calgary area code I had not spoken to in 14 years. I picked up the phone. The metal was cold in my hands. The same hands that had spent 4 decades drafting engineering schematics and eventually rebuilding my entire life from a rented room above a hardware store on Elgin Street. I answered without saying anything. Just listened. The breathing on the other end was ragged, young, choked. Grandpa. The word landed somewhere deep in my chest. It was Caden. The last time I had seen my grandson, he was 8 years old, running along the dock at the Georgian Bay property in his rubber boots, completely unaware that his parents were inside the house, forging my signature on a stack of legal documents. He had no idea what they were doing. He never could have. I let the silence sit between us. Let 14 years of absence fill the space. "Grandpa, please don't hang up." His voice cracked hard. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know any of it. We were in my structural engineering lecture today, and Professor Hadley put your project on the board, the Pinecrest Complex, and he said your name. He said you built it from scratch, that you started the Pinecrest Foundation with almost nothing and turned it into one of the largest affordable senior housing organizations in Northern Ontario. A short, broken breath, and then I Googled your name. The Globe and Mail article came up, the one from last year. It says you lost everything. It says you were left without a home. Is that true? Did they do that to you? I closed my eyes. From where I sat on the top floor of my office building in Sudbury, the city stretched out quietly below me in the November dark. "Yes, Caden," I said. My voice was steady. "That's true." He sobbed. It was a young man's sob, full of a grief that had no name yet, because he was only just understanding what it was for. "They told me you walked out," he said. "Mom and Dad. They told me you abandoned us after Grandma died. They said you had a breakdown, that you drained the family accounts and disappeared. Dad said you didn't want anything to do with us." The words came faster now. "But the article, it said you started the foundation 15 years ago with almost nothing. It said a power of attorney transfer had been disputed in court. Grandpa, what did they actually do?" I opened my mouth to answer him, and then I heard the scuffle. A door banging open on his end, Caden gasping, a brief struggle, and then my son's voice, Wesley, came through the line like a cold draft under a door. "Dad." The word was breathless, practiced in its panic, but underneath it, unmistakable. The sound of a man who had just discovered that his father was not dead or destitute after all, but sitting at the top of something very large. "Dad, oh my God. We've been trying to find you. You have no idea what it's been like. We didn't know if you were even." I pulled the phone away from my ear, looked at the red button, pressed it. The room went quiet again. The next move was his. Mine was already in motion. 14 years earlier, I had come home from my wife's funeral in the rain. We had been married 31 years. She died of pancreatic cancer in the spring, and those months of her illness had hollowed me out in a way I have no clean words for. I was not sleeping. I was barely eating. I was heavily medicated for anxiety and grief, barely capable of reading my own mail. Wesley and his wife, Tamara, had moved into the house in February, ostensibly to help. They cooked. They ran errands. They were there when I needed someone nearby, and I told myself that meant something. One evening, Wesley came to me with a stack of papers. He said they were standard estate planning documents. A power of attorney designation, some account consolidation forms, beneficiary updates. He said our family lawyer had recommended them. He laid them out on the kitchen table and pointed to each line I needed to sign, one after another, not rushing, not hovering, calm and patient, the way a person is patient when the outcome is already certain. I trusted him. He was my son. I signed. 3 weeks after my wife's burial, I returned from a long walk to find the front door lock had been changed. I stood on the porch step, pressing my key into the lock and getting nothing. I walked around the back. The garage was empty. Through the kitchen window, I could see the living room had been stripped. The furniture, the bookshelves, her things, my drafting table, everything gone. A white envelope was visible on the kitchen table from where I stood outside in the cold. The envelope contained 150 Canadian dollars, and the note, "You'll manage." What I know now, because Lionel, my chief legal counsel, spent nearly 2 years unraveling it, is that the power of attorney I signed had been drawn up by a different law firm entirely, not our family lawyer. A private notary Wesley had retained on his own. It gave him full authority over my accounts and property. He moved quickly. He liquidated the RRSP. He sold the Georgian Bay property, the cottage my father had built in 1962, the place where I had spent every summer of my life, to a private buyer for well below market value, because speed mattered more to him than price. He and Tamara loaded the truck, drove it west, and started over in Calgary. They left me with $150 and 2 words. I will not tell you that what followed was simple. I spent 8 months doing piecemeal consulting work for a municipal engineering firm in Sudbury on contract pay, sleeping in a rented room above a hardware store on Elgin Street. I was 64 years old and beginning from nothing. There were nights at the small folding table in that room with my drafting pencils and a cup of reheated coffee when I thought very dark thoughts. But I did not lay down. I had spent 40 years designing structures meant to hold weight. I understood load-bearing better than most people. I knew the difference between a structure that bends and one that breaks. I decided I was the kind that bends. Within 3 years, I had incorporated a small engineering consultancy. Within 5, I had secured provincial funding to design the first affordable senior housing land development for Greater Sudbury. Within 10 years, the Pinecrest Foundation had 7 properties across northern Ontario, a full legal department, and a waiting list of hundreds of elderly residents who would otherwise have nowhere to go. The Globe and Mail ran a feature on us the previous January. I had not planned to be found, but I had not hidden either. I simply built something worthy of being seen. Now Wesley was calling 178 times in 9 hours. He flew in from Calgary 3 days later. He walked into my boardroom in a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent and did not waste time on anything resembling a genuine apology. He sat down, placed a folder on the glass table, and pushed it toward me. Inside was a proposal. $2.5 million. His Calgary condo development company was in serious financial trouble, he said. A temporary liquidity problem. A bad quarter in a difficult market. He used the right language in the right order, the way people do when they have been rehearsing for weeks. Tamara sat beside him. She had aged in 14 years, as we all had, but she carried herself with the same composed ease that had always put me slightly on edge. She let Wesley do the talking for a while. Then she leaned forward and told me, with a straight face, that growing up without a grandfather had been deeply damaging for Caden, that my sudden disappearance from his life had left a wound that had never fully healed. She said that while the loan was the immediate priority, we also needed to discuss a trust fund for Caden, something meaningful, to compensate for the years he had been denied a grandfather's guidance and presence in his life. She said this to me, in my boardroom, 14 years after she wrote the note. I did not raise my voice. I looked at the $2.5 million proposal. I looked at Tamara. I looked at Wesley. Then I let the silence stretch long enough that Wesley's left knee started bouncing beneath the table. He broke first. He slammed his palm flat on the glass. The crack echoed through the room. He told me to stop dragging things out. He said I was sitting on a fortune I had no use for at my age. He said I owed them, for the grief my disappearance had caused, for the years of uncertainty, for everything they had endured not knowing whether I was alive or dead. He leaned across the table and told me that blood had to count for something, that family had a meaning, and that I had a responsibility to the people who shared my name. He believed his own story, completely. He had told it so many times it had calcified inside him. He was not performing. He was genuinely outraged at me for making him wait. I looked at my son's flushed, furious face and felt very little. Not coldness, exactly, more like clarity, the kind that comes when a long confusion finally resolves itself. I told him I would need a few days to consider. I told him I wanted him and Tamara at the Pinecrest Foundation's annual benefit dinner, at the Fairmont Royal York in Toronto that Friday. I told him that in front of the foundation's major donors, board members, and the press. I intended to make a public announcement about the future of the foundation and my estate. I told him that if he was there, he would learn exactly what he was owed. Wesley's posture changed immediately. The tension left his shoulders. The calculation behind his eyes sharpened into something almost warm. He nodded once, and the corner of his mouth lifted. He thought he had won. After they left, I called Lionel into the boardroom. Lionel had been my legal counsel for 11 years. When I had asked him, 3 weeks earlier, the moment Caden first called me, to begin a thorough financial investigation into my son's affairs, he had not asked a single unnecessary question. He placed his briefcase on the table and opened it. Wesley's development company in Calgary was not experiencing a temporary liquidity problem. It was insolvent. And it was insolvent for specific documentable reasons. For the past 4 years, Wesley had been treating investor capital as a personal expense account. He had drawn funds from 2 separate residential development projects, funds that belonged to his private investors, to cover costs that had nothing to do with construction. International travel, private school tuition paid in cash, undisclosed renovations to a Kelowna vacation property registered in Tamara's maiden name. He had fabricated contractor invoices to disguise the withdrawals. 3 months ago, Lionel told me, 2 institutional investors had noticed irregularities during a routine audit. They had hired a forensic accounting firm. The forensic accountants had filed a report with the RCMP Financial Crime Unit in Alberta. My son was under active investigation. He had not come to Toronto because he missed his father. He had come because he needed $2.5 million in accessible funds to close a hole before federal investigators arrived at his office door. I stood up and walked to the window. Sudbury was gray and cold, the kind of November afternoon that feels like a held breath. I thought about Wesley sitting in his hotel room at that moment, telling Tamara the old man was going to come through. I wanted him to sleep well that night. I wanted him to wake up Friday morning believing the next chapter of his life was already written. I turned to Lionel. I told him not to call the RCMP yet. I told him to let Wesley dress for the occasion and walk the red carpet and stand in that ballroom and feel, completely and entirely, that he had won. I wanted my son at the absolute top of the pedestal before I pulled it out from under him. Lionel nodded once and picked up his briefcase. There was one other conversation I needed to have first. I met Caden at a small, independent coffee shop near the U of T campus, a narrow place on a side street in the Annex neighborhood that smelled of cedar and old radiators. He came in looking wrecked, the kind of exhausted that sleep doesn't fix. He sat across from me and stared at the table for a long time before looking up. I placed a small flash drive on the table between us. I told him what was on it. I told him about the forensic accounting report, about the RCMP investigation, about the $2.5 million ask. I told him his parents had not flown to Toronto for a family reconciliation. They had come because they were cornered, and they had decided the safest place to shelter was behind me. Caden covered his face with his hands. I told him everything, the power of attorney, coming home to a changed lock and an empty house, the envelope and the note. I told him plainly, the way you tell someone a difficult truth when you respect them enough not to soften it into nothing. When I finished, he sat for a long time without speaking. Then, very quietly, he said that they were monsters. He said it like a man hearing his own diagnosis for the first time, deciding what it meant for everything that came after. I did not disagree. I let him sit in it. It was not comfortable to watch, a 22-year-old losing his parents while they were still alive, but it was necessary. The truth was the only real foundation he had left, and I was not going to take it from him. After a while, I pushed the flash drive a little closer to him. I told him that on Friday evening, just before I walked onto the stage at the benefit dinner, I needed him to take that drive and find a man near the service entrance at the back of the ballroom. A man in a dark overcoat. I told him to hand the drive to that man, and then find a place where he could see the stage clearly. Caden looked at the drive, then he looked at me. He asked who the man in the overcoat was. I told him that for 22 years, other people had made his choices for him. They had chosen what he believed, and who he trusted and what story he lived inside. That Friday night, the choice belonged entirely to him. He could take the drive and walk to the back of that room, or he could leave it on the table and stand with his parents. I finished my coffee, stood up, and left him there with the drive, sitting between his hands. The Fairmont Royal York, on a Friday night in November, was everything I needed it to be. Wesley and Tamara arrived early and made the most of it. They worked the room like people who believed they were already inheriting it. Wesley shook hands with board members and major donors, projecting the particular confidence of a man who has decided the evening is already his. Tamara stood at his elbow with a smile like a press release, wearing a dress that had been charged to my corporate account that afternoon, a detail Lionel had flagged me about by 6 o'clock. I watched from the curved mezzanine balcony above the main hall. The acoustics carried their voices up perfectly. A journalist from a financial publication spotted me in the shadows above the crowd and pointed. Heads turned upward. Wesley found me on the balcony, and his expression shifted into something he had practiced, the proud, patient son, waiting for his moment. I smiled at him, said nothing, and went to find my notes. When I walked to the podium, the room went quiet almost immediately. These were people who understood that when a founder takes the stage at an annual benefit dinner, you stop talking. I looked out over the room, the donors, the journalists, the board members, and in the front row my son and his wife, barely keeping still. I told them that 14 years ago I had returned from my wife's burial to find my home locked and empty, and that the only thing waiting for me was an envelope containing $150 and a note that said to manage. I told them I had managed. I said that everything the Pinecrest Foundation had built, the 7 housing complexes, the legal advocacy unit, the emergency intervention fund for seniors facing financial abuse, had grown from that envelope. I said the $150 was still in my possession, and it would be the first item transferred to the Foundation's permanent public collection. Then I announced the formation of the Managewell Trust, a new legal entity into which I was transferring 100% of my corporate equity, personal holdings, and liquid assets. Its mandate to identify, investigate, and pursue legal action against family members who exploit their elderly relatives through fraudulent powers of attorney, forged documents, and financial coercion. To fund legal teams for people who have no one else left to fight for them. No personal heirs, no inheritance. Not 1 cent of what I had built would pass to my bloodline. Wesley's face took 4 seconds to come apart. I counted them. The prepared smile, the squared shoulders, the ease, all of it dissolved at once, and what was underneath was not grief or regret. It was a man who had just understood that the money was gone, and with it the only thing standing between him and a federal investigation. He lunged against the velvet divider rope and shouted that I was confused. He pointed up at the podium and told the room that someone needed to step in, that this was a mistake, that I didn't understand what I was doing. Every camera in the room swung toward him. Tamara grabbed the microphone from a journalist's hand and started talking into it, fast, desperate, building a new story on the spot, the one where she and Wesley were the abandoned ones, the wronged ones, the family that had suffered in silence, while I lived in comfort and called it philanthropy. She was loud, and for about 15 seconds she had the room. Then a door at the back of the ballroom opened. Caden walked in. He did not run. He walked in a straight line down the center aisle with his jaw set and his shoulders back, and the room went quiet around him the way it goes quiet when something real is happening. He walked right up to his mother. She reached out one hand, a reflex, the automatic gesture of a woman who had spent 22 years managing her son's proximity to the truth. He took the microphone from her hand. He looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he turned to face the room. He told them his name. He said he was an engineering student at the University of Toronto, and that 4 days ago he had seen his grandfather's name on a photograph of a building, and that everything he thought he knew about his own family had turned out to be a lie. He told the room what his parents had told him for his entire childhood, that his grandfather was the one who walked away, that the grandfather was the one who left them. And then he told them what the documents actually showed: the power of attorney, the Georgian Bay property, the RRSP, the $150, and the note. He turned and pointed at his father. He said his father was not a real estate developer navigating a difficult quarter. He said his father was under active RCMP investigation for defrauding investors of over $3 million. He said his father had come to Toronto not to reconcile with his family, but to use an old man as a human shield against a federal investigation. The room erupted. Investors in the back rows were already on their phones. Journalists were shouting across each other. Wesley's network of credibility in that room, every handshake from earlier that evening, was curdling fast. Wesley screamed something. He vaulted the velvet rope. His eyes were on Caden. I could see from the stage what was coming, the same way you can see a structure failing before it falls, because you recognize the early signals. He was going to hit his own son. I stepped in front of Caden and drove both hands hard into Wesley's chest. He stumbled backward. The hotel security team was on him immediately, 4 of them, professional and prepared, who had clearly been watching the situation build for some time. Wesley hit the floor. Tamara let go of the microphone and went to her knees at the edge of the stage, grabbing at my pant leg, telling me it was a misunderstanding, that they could give it all back, that we were family, that I had to tell the RCMP it was all a mistake. I looked down at her. I felt no anger, nothing that I could name as anything other than a very long and difficult winter finally ending. I stepped back until her fingers slipped free of the fabric. Then I crouched down so she could hear me clearly over the noise of the room. "You'll manage," I said. The same 2 words she had written 14 years ago in her careful, slanted hand. The sound that came out of her had no shape I could describe. She collapsed against the carpet, and the security team began working through the evening's wreckage. 2 RCMP officers in plain clothes were already moving through the room. Caden had delivered the flash drive exactly where I had asked him to. Wesley and Tamara did not go quietly. They went the way cornered people always go, loudly and separately, each one trying to be the first to offer a version of events that reduced their own exposure. By the time they reached the lobby, Wesley was telling the officers that Tamara had orchestrated the original power of attorney fraud alone, and Tamara was providing a detailed account of Wesley's offshore transfers that she had apparently been cataloging for her own purposes for some time. The officers barely had to ask a question. They simply kept the recording running. The trial ran for 7 months. I sat in the witness stand for 2 hours and answered every question with the same steadiness I had brought to the podium at the Royal York. I did not perform. I stated facts. The forensic accountants stated facts. The documents stated facts. Wesley's own words from that evening, captured on video by multiple journalists, stated facts. The pattern of behavior the prosecution laid out was not complicated. A man who had defrauded his grieving father 14 years ago had continued defrauding people for 14 years after that, because no one had stopped him. The judge sentenced them each to 12 years. I drove to see my son once, at the federal institution outside Kingston. He looked diminished. The suit was gone. The ease was gone. Whatever had animated his face in a room full of potential, that particular energy was gone too. He picked up the phone on his side of the plexiglass, and I picked up mine. He apologized, at some length. It sounded like what it was. The apology of a man who had had months to rehearse it, delivered to the one person whose forgiveness might still mean something to his self-image. There was some real feeling in it, but it was not what I had come for. After he finished, he shifted forward in his chair. He said the conditions were hard, the food was bad, the isolation was worse. He said he had nothing left. He asked if I could arrange a small regular deposit into his commissary account. Just something modest, he said. Just enough for a few basic necessities. I reached into my jacket pocket. I took out a white envelope I had prepared before the drive. I slid it through the tray at the bottom of the glass panel. Inside was $150. Wesley stared at the envelope. He looked up at me. I said, "That's exactly what you left me." I watched the understanding move across his face, not all at once, but in stages, each one heavier than the last. He pressed his fist against his mouth. His shoulders shook. This time, the grief had no audience to perform for, which is perhaps how I knew it was real. I set the phone back on its hook, stood up, and walked out into the November afternoon. 2 years after that, on a warm June morning at Convocation Hall in Toronto, I sat in the front row of the engineering graduation ceremony and watched my grandson receive his degree. Caden had worked 20 hours a week at the Manage Well Trust for 2 full years, answering phones, processing intake forms, sitting across from elderly people who had lost their savings to the people they trusted most. He had paid his own rent on a clerk's wage. He had paid down the loan debt Wesley had fraudulently taken out in his name, dollar by dollar, because that was what the contract between us had specified, and he had signed it without complaint. He had not asked me for a single dollar in cash. When the dean introduced the student selected to give the convocation address, she called my grandson's name. Caden walked to the podium in his gown and stood for a moment looking out at the crowd. When he spoke, his voice was measured and clear. He said the most important lesson he had learned at university had not come from any textbook or any lecture hall. He said it had come in the form of a plain white envelope and 2 words that told him the world owed him nothing and everything was still possible. He looked down at the front row. He said the man who had changed his life had not done it by writing a check. He had done it by drawing a hard line and holding it. He said his grandfather had taught him that the most valuable thing a person can build is not something made of steel and concrete, but the kind of character that holds weight when everything around it is failing. The applause in Convocation Hall was a physical thing, something you felt in the chest. I did not stand up. I sat in my chair with my hands folded in my lap and let the sound wash over me, and I felt, for the first time in a very long time, nothing that needed to be resolved. After the ceremony, Caden found me on the lawn outside. He was still in his gown, his diploma rolled in one hand. He stopped in front of me, and we did not say a great deal, because we had reached the point that takes time to reach, where 2 people understand each other well enough that the silence between them is not empty. Someone nearby offered to take our picture. I stood beside my grandson in the June sunlight, and I let myself smile. A real one. It reached my eyes. The Manage Well Trust now operates across 8 provinces. Its intake team processes over 4,000 cases per year. In the lobby of the main office in Sudbury, mounted on a simple piece of polished pine, is a white envelope inside a small frame. The envelope is open so that anyone who walks through the door can read the note inside from where they stand. "You'll manage." Beneath it, on a small brass plate, the caption reads, "The foundation of everything we built." I spend most of my mornings now at a small property I purchased on Georgian Bay. Not the same lot my father built on, which belongs to someone else now, but a stretch of shoreline a few kilometers north. The water looks the same. The rocks are the same pink granite. The birches at the water's edge turn gold in September the way they always have, the way they will long after I am gone. I sit on the dock with my coffee and my drafting pencils. Old habits are the last things to leave you, and I think about what it means to build something that holds. My son believed he was leaving me at the bottom of a hole I could not climb out of. He was not wrong that I was in a hole. He was wrong about everything else. The quiet of a person who has been wronged is not the same as the quiet of defeat. Sometimes the difference takes 14 years to become visible, but it always becomes visible. If you believe that the people who count you out don't always get to write the ending, leave a comment, hit like, and subscribe. There's more where this came from.